Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Machine Design webcast. Our topic today is Label Compliance Challenges for Small and Medium-Sized Medical Device Companies, sponsored by Prisym ID. I'm Carlos Gonzalez with Penton's Design Engineering Sourcing Group. To begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First of all, if you have any technical difficulties during today's session, simply hit F5 to refresh your webcast console. If you need assistance solving common issues, please click on the yellow help icon below the slides. Additionally, we welcome your questions during today's event. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the main presentation, but please feel free to send in your questions at any time. To do so, simply type your questions into the question window on the side of your screen and hit the submit button. Also, please be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Machine Design website within the next week. You will be notified by email when the archive is available. Then let's meet today's speakers. With over 25 years of experience in enterprise software solutions across many sectors, Chris Lentz has spent the last several years implementing and bringing to the market SaaS offerings that enable organizations to access high-quality services based on leading software technologies. Working closely with life sciences, focused close provider, and Prisym ID's test and validation experts to deliver a compliance-ready solution for small to medium-sized companies in the medical device sector. Chris manages the SaaS operations team and maintains relationships with customers to ensure ongoing feedback and development. Will Graham has over 25 years in process and quality systems design, development, and implementation in regulated industries including medical device, chemical, pharmaceutical, automotive, and aerospace. With specialist expertise and certification in quality management, Will is fully versed in the challenges facing medical device manufacturers. Now let me turn things over to our presenters. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlos, and I'd just like to add my thanks and welcome to everybody for joining us today. I just wanted to take a few moments to run quickly through the agenda, the topics we're going to cover during today's session. We'll kick off by looking at the challenges that are facing the small to medium-sized enterprises in this sector. We'll have some discussion around those. I guess they'll be mostly familiar to you. And then we'll move on to looking at the cloud solution, software as a service, and whether it can help. We'll look at some of the concerns and benefits of those types of solution. Our business is label data management, so we'll obviously be looking at labeling specifically in the cloud, and we'll talk a little bit about that before I hand over to Will, who will go through how it works for GQSI. And we'll finish off with an overview of the new Prisym SaaS offering and how we think that is a solution that can help small to medium-sized enterprises in this space, and then move on to the Q&A session at the end. First of all, if we have a look at the challenges, the top 3 challenges. When you were signing up or registering for this webinar, we asked you to answer some questions and asked you to pick out your top 3 challenges from a list of things which were a problem in terms of meeting labeling compliance. The overwhelmingly highest scoring challenge was the lack of a dedicated compliance team or dedicated compliance resources. Over 60% of those who responded to the question pulled out that particular issue as their major challenge, which is interesting, as we'll see later on. The second highest challenge was knowledge management within the organization. This is the situation where specific individuals may have knowledge, maybe trying to share that knowledge around and so on within the organization. Again, fairly high score, not as high as the previous one, but 38% of respondees. And then the next challenge, which again is not a huge surprise, is a lack of access to IT resources. So that was interesting, and thanks very much for taking the time to respond to those questions for us. So let's have a look at the challenges in terms of the regulations and what they mean to organisations. We're all very familiar with the requirements imposed by the various regulatory bodies. We don't need to go through them here, but we do obviously need to acknowledge and recognise that there are requirements, and they do exist. And they obviously exist for a very good reason. They're challenging, but they're absolutely necessary. The main player in this space, of course, is the FDA. They, in effect, set the standard for other organizations to follow, but there are other organizations that have their own standards, their own requirements, and so on, in the different regions around the world. There always seem to be new regulations and new requirements coming along. It's somewhat of a fact of life. For example, hot on the heels of UDI, we've all just been getting up to speed with UDI and meeting those requirements, and now we have the EU's equivalent, their MDR, their medical device regulations. They're going to need to be met in the next few years if you want to sell your products into the EU market. So there's a challenge coming up already. And then within these different regulations and requirements, there are other standards that you have to adhere to. So that's going to be things like barcode symbologies, the standards for the various barcode types that you might be using the right pictograms on labels to indicate things like expiry date, etc., etc. All of these things need to be done properly. They all need to be adhered to. Of course, this all comes with the territory, not just for medical device, but obviously anywhere where label data has to be regulated. We accept it as a necessary thing. The biggest challenge, as we've just seen, of course, for smaller organisations is that lack of a dedicated compliance team or lack of access to compliance resources. The good news is that the regulators do recognise the burden. So, for example, the FDA itself advocates that companies adopt what they call the least burdensome approach to validation. They're not actually saying exactly how an organisation must achieve compliance. The focus is on what you have to do to achieve that compliance. They're not telling you how to do it, they're just telling you basically what it is that you need to do. And validation is all about the process itself. So as you know, it's about being able to demonstrate the required objectives are achieved by being able to provide objective evidence that due process has been followed in order to reach that objective, in order to reach, how did you get to compliance? You need to be able to prove how you did it by enabling access to this objective evidence if you need to provide it. So it's the process and the systems that process uses that are critical for providing that evidence. Simple example, when and who approved a change for a label. That needs to be tracked somewhere, needs to be recorded. So making sure that's all available is at the core of the process. Any process created, of course, needs to be manageable, it needs to be repeatable and scalable. There's not a lot of point in creating a process that works right now, but you need to tweak it and need to modify it every time you do something slightly different. So the companies will often look to computerized systems that automate as much of the process as possible so that repeatability and that scalability is achievable. This is where things like the GAMP or Good Automated Manufacturing Practices come into play. They describe a risk-based approach to compliant computerized systems. We're not here today to go through the details of GAMP and what it provides and what it prescribes, but it does define a number of steps that are designed to help organizations achieve validation and improve compliance and bring greater efficiency. The interesting one from the perspective of today's webinar is they do have a description stating that regulated companies, in this case, for example, medical device providers, should seek to maximize supplier involvement throughout the system lifecycle in order to take advantage or leverage that supplier's experience, their knowledge, their expertise, and so on. We'll come back to this shortly, but an example of what that could mean is it may be assisting with requirements gathering, risk assessments, creating functional specifications, but also things like supplier documentation, so test documentation, installation qualification documentations, those kinds of things And the idea is to avoid wasted effort and duplication. One of the things that GAMP5 believes is that many costly testing cycles are duplicated and do little or nothing to protect, for example, patients. So the regulators do recognise this burden. However, that's all well and good, but at the end of the day, these requirements are applicable across all sizes of organisation, and they are requirements and they do have to be met. Now, it's enough of a challenge for very large organisations with dedicated teams of compliance and QA and RA specialists to achieve this. But the regulations don't differentiate between these multi-billion-dollar companies with global operations. They don't differentiate between those and startups or highly specialised small companies with only one or two folks who look after regulatory matters. And those folks will typically be wearing multiple hats within the organisation. The requirements are applicable across the board, largest to smallest organisations, whether you've got one product or hundreds of products. Many smaller companies we know don't have the resources to implement, validate and maintain a complex IT infrastructure, to manage control and quality management systems, to implement necessary IT and so on. What you need to do in that situation, if you're a smaller company, is you need to decide how and what is the most cost-effective way for you to deal with this burden of compliance. One of the other questions that we asked during the sign-up process, we asked people registering for the webinar to answer was, do they or do they not have an automated labelling process at the moment? Or the question was, is your labelling process manual or automated? The results of that, 78% of those who replied were basically saying everything is done manually. 22% have an automated process. Now, clearly we don't have the details of what those processes consist of, but you can see from that number immediately that manual processes are the dominant way to do it. So you need to think about how you're going to address this burden. There are manual processes, as we've seen, and they work perfectly well. They're perfectly acceptable. They work, and they might work for you fine, but there are risks involved with them. It's a fairly well-known understanding that any human touch in any process introduces a risk of error. That's applicable to any process. But where that finite attention to detail is required and the process is repetitive, it's a demanding requirement, and it is clearly exposing risk of errors. It is difficult to remove people completely from this sort of process, but it's a good idea to try and reduce the manual touch as much as possible. Manual processes are often dependent on specific individuals. This goes back to that the 38% for whom one of the top 3 challenges was knowledge management within the organisation. These individuals will know the process well. They understand the nuances. They've been doing it for years, but the dependency that creates is obviously again a risk. You know, what if that person leaves the organisation? Maybe they retire. Maybe they're off sick, and so on. So there is a risk there. And typically, the more manual intervention that a process requires, the longer that process is going to take. You know, that could be because of the dependencies we just talked about, or it might simply be because it takes time to pass a piece of paper between 2 individuals, 2 departments, and so on. So there is a potential time cost there as well. At the other end of the spectrum, in this decision on how to address the burden, is to go through a computer system validation with the aim of implementing a fully 21 CFR Part 820 and Part 11 compliant environment, enabling automation of record keeping, label data content, change audit, and so on. This is obviously commendable, but it's going to typically be quite costly or very costly. It will need a robust underlying infrastructure. There will be capital expense required on software and hardware. You have to administer the environment and so on. And that's before you factor in the cost of the validation process itself. So these systems are complex, and they will often involve the customer paying for functionality designed for these large, global, multi billion-dollar enterprises. So for the smaller company, those sorts of solutions will often be too expensive. For the SME, the reality is that most organisations will probably adopt a combination of both. There'll be an element of manual input. Maybe where there's only one or two individuals involved, it might just be the most effective and expedient way to get some things done. Other things, for example, version control, automated audit trails. These are things that are better handled in an automated environment where things just get recorded as they take place. You don't have to do anything. So some aspects are much better handled by a system. So the combined approach can work well. Obviously, it depends on how it's implemented and how it's done. And also in this area, this is where the recommendation to leverage supply involvement comes back into play. Companies like Prisym ID, we specialise in implementation of validated and compliant solutions. And we've got many years of experience dealing with a wide range of requirements across different types of organisations. So we should be called upon to help customers and bring that expertise to bear and to help those organisations achieve this sort of compliance. So that's something that you can think about when you're implementing these environments. So there, whilst there are ways to address the burdens, there are obviously aspects which, for a smaller company, make some of those methods not quite so achievable. So for today's webinar, the question is, can the cloud help? Can the cloud help to alleviate some of these problems? Before we go into that, let's have a quick recap on what the cloud is. If you ask 10 different people what a cloud environment is, you're going to get 10 different answers. But in the context of the session today, we're really talking about access to IT resources via the internet, and in this specific case, by IT resources, what I mean is typically an application, accessing an application that's offered as software as a service or SaaS via the internet. Use of SaaS solutions has been steadily growing in both the business and consumer worlds. One statistic I have here is that between 2011 and 2014, cloud adoption increased from 13%, in other words, 13% of companies using the cloud in 2011 to 74% using the cloud in 2014, so a huge jump. The curve has flattened off a little bit in recent years as it's become more commonplace, but the trend does continue. And a piece of research that was carried out in January of this year, so this is right up to date, they did a poll of over 1,000 IT professionals, over 50% of whom were from the SME sector, interestingly. Of those 1,000 or so IT professionals, 95% responded that they are using the cloud. And one of the questions, it was a fairly extensive survey, but one question which was interesting for today's conversation was, does your organisation run workload in the cloud? And the response was that for these small to medium-sized businesses, or SMBs as they called them in their survey, over 80% of the workload, 83% of the workload is now run in the cloud. So that's a huge shift to using cloud-based services. Now, this survey did not focus on life sciences. And life sciences has been cautious, and that's for good and sensible reasons. That life sciences is typically fairly cautious in taking up new technologies. But things are changing. There are an increasing number of SaaS applications offered to life sciences organisations. We have our own Prisym SaaS solution, which we'll talk about a bit later on. Companies like ReadTech have SaaS UDI solutions, and so on. And as we've mentioned, validation is about the process. It's not about the technology used. And the FDA doesn't actually specify anywhere whether you should or should not use the cloud. That's, like I said, they're just telling you about what you need to achieve. They're not telling you how to achieve it. So they actually refer to cloud infrastructure just as a part of their definition of a computer or related system. So they're not saying you can or can't use the cloud. So in other words, as long as the correct process and checks and balances are in place, there's no reason not to take advantage of a cloud-based SaaS offering if it meets your needs. And of course, you can provide that objective evidence should you need it. So, given the response of respondents in the research that we just looked at, and the fact that it wasn't life sciences focused, what I'd like to do now is just around the audience, just ask a couple of questions just to see how the cloud and SaaS is being taken up within life sciences organisations, given that in this group we are predominantly life sciences. So if we could just if I could ask you to use the survey. You should have a survey slide in front of you now. If you could just tick on yes or no to answer the question, are you using any SaaS business applications at the moment? We'll take a half a minute or so to let everybody respond, but if you could just respond to that question, and then we'll take a look and see how that comes back. Just about to give it a few more seconds. Okay, so let's move on and see what sort of a response we've had. That's a very interesting response. So we're using any SaaS business applications. 25%, only 25% are saying yes. 75% are saying no. That's an interesting response. So thank you very much for that. And actually, that means that when I ask the next question, I have a sort of feeling what the answer is going to be. This is just another quick question here. Are you using SaaS for any life sciences related applications? So the previous question was any application. With this one, just trying to get to a feel for whether any life sciences related applications are being used as SaaS offerings. So that could be, maybe UDI submission. It might be a QMS quality management system or what have you. So again, we can just take a couple of seconds to answer that. Given the previous response, I think I know what the answers might be. Okay, let's have a look. Yep. Okay. Interesting. An even bigger difference between those who are and those who aren't. Well, hopefully, my challenge today is to try and do something to make those numbers go a little bit the other way. But let's move on and have a look at some more information here. Thank you very much for that. So obviously, those numbers are interesting, and there will be reasons for that. There are often a number of concerns expressed about using SaaS or the cloud in general. When you think of some of the benefits, the questions are often asked, well, why isn't everybody using it? These concerns tend to be very legitimate, and they haven't actually changed very much over the years. The actual concerns themselves are typically the same ones get raised every time, but what has happened, what I have noticed over the years is the degree to which they are a concern is reducing as more and more organizations do take up cloud offerings. But the first one is, not surprisingly, is security. And in the context of, is my data safe? Can I control access to it? SaaS providers and cloud providers should really be providing assurance to you, the customers, by implementing security models and best practices around their applications and their environments. So, for example, if you're accessing an online banking application, if you're using PayPal or one of those other environments, you'll notice you have the padlock symbol in the URL. There's a green bar typically that indicates that it's a heavily protected environment from the point of view of encryption and so on. Those green bars, those padlocks are not just for banks, they're not just for financial applications or financial environments. They're actually applicable to any SaaS offering. So, the providers should be implementing those kinds of protections to help you feel the assurance that you need. They should be conducting regular independent security, penetration, and access testing. It's no good a SaaS provider conducting their own tests and assuring you that they've done it. They should be making sure they do these tests regularly, but also having them done by independent third parties, so that you can actually see the evidence of them doing those things. Ongoing security monitoring, and also in the context of the FDA, think about the systems, the way in which potentially something like a closed system can be achieved using a SaaS offering. Is it possible? Can it be done? And does the application that you're using have the capability to achieve that? The bottom line here is that the cloud providers, and in particular the folks who look after the infrastructures, they have the best resources and expertise in IT security, and a lot to lose if customers are not confident with that security. So security is something that is a concern, but there are ways to mitigate those concerns. Second most common concern is typically reliability. You need to know you can log on. Your customers have strict deadlines, so you want to know that you can provide what you need to get to them in time. And similarly to security, the cloud providers, they're going to have the most experience in implementing the kind of highly available and resilient architectures and infrastructures that are needed to assure reliability. So they have the best and most reliable systems, and more importantly, they can actually afford to put these systems in. So the kind of resilience that these cloud providers have are using technologies and capabilities that are not going to be available to smaller organizations. So it's their bread and butter. They need to make sure they're secure. They need to make sure they're reliable. Performance can often be raised as an issue. Performance is a bit subjective, but we all know that when we hit enter or when we click OK, we don't want to sit there waiting for some time before something happens. Clearly, the cloud or SaaS provider can't control the reliability or the speed of the customer's internet service provider, but things like the architecture of the application, the design of the application can mitigate any performance issues in your links to the internet. So you should be looking at things like the type of application, how much traffic is sent over the wires, those kinds of things. At the end of the day, some companies, no matter how small or large they are just not going to use SaaS or cloud because they want to retain control over everything. But these days, more and more organizations don't have that luxury, and indeed, they don't actually have that desire. In the SME space, what you're doing by adopting a SaaS product is, in effect, outsourcing a lot of the issues around reliability, security, and performance to the cloud provider. That leaves you free to focus on the things that you want to do with the application itself. For life sciences, of course, we do have an additional concern, which doesn't crop up in the general space, but it certainly does in the regulated space, and that's the question of validation. Can a cloud-based solution be compliant? So here we need to remember that it's all about the process, that the technology is a means to an end. Nothing can be compliant without the appropriate process around it. So the validation aspect is all around how much effort you have to expend to make the process you have implemented compliant using a SaaS solution. Ideally, the SaaS offering should take the bulk of that effort away from you. So those challenges that we talked about at the beginning, what you're looking for is a SaaS solution or SaaS solutions that enable you to minimize the amount of that you have to worry about. And of course, you've got things like documentation packs and so on, as we discussed earlier, leveraging that supplier involvement. So there are concerns, yes, that's very true. They can be mitigated, and they do need to be balanced against the potential benefits, which, whilst cloud has significant benefits for most organizations, there are particular upsides for smaller businesses. For a start, there's an awful lot you don't have to worry about. So you're thinking about the hardware, the software licenses, databases, administration of the environment, upgrades, all of those things, those maintenance and housekeeping tasks are demanding on time and resources. SaaS solutions means that you can offload all of that and you can focus on the core function that the application is required for example, label data management. You do have access to different commercial arrangements. So you'll typically have things like pay-as-you-go subscriptions, monthly bills, consumption-based pricing, prepayment models. What these do is often enable a much lower cost of entry without any upfront license purchase costs. So again, for a smaller company, having a predictable monthly cost makes it much easier to budget for your operating expenses. So the application becomes an operational rather than a capital expense. You're not going to be locked in or hampered by a lack of scalability, and you do get access to sophisticated applications, but without the long-term commitment that a licensed software purchase, which smaller organizations may find hard to cost justify. The other thing to think about if you are looking at SaaS offerings is to consider the application itself. So looking for applications that do more than just the basics. So future-proofing your implementation by looking for quality solutions. The better the application, the better the long-term return on investment. So time spent implementing a high-quality application in the short term will give you a lot of payback in the end. So if we look at labeling itself, what are the challenges around labeling in the cloud, and what about a SaaS-based approach for that? How does that stack up? It obviously is going to depend on the solution. You need to think about what you want to achieve and whether the solution provides that. How much effort is going to be required to achieve compliance? If it doesn't relieve the burden that we talked about earlier by enabling things like version control, automated audit, e-signature compliance, user management, you need to question whether it's providing the value that you want from it. So think about what it is that you want to achieve and how that fits in your environment. Ideally, the solution should be able to replace or complement your existing processes for label data management, but still obviously provide the labels that you need. And it needs to be able to do that with minimal disruption to your production operations during the transition or during the implementation. Then there are other things to consider, like security, user management, controlling who can do what, where can they do it from, when can they do it. Look for tightly controlled access and permissions based on roles and responsibilities. Thinking about remote access, do you have remote subcontractors that might need to access the environment, or that you want to be able to just get them to print labels for you? Managing the data, it's very important obviously to keep the data up to date, maybe synchronized with a UDI submission solution. And it's also important to be able to populate labels automatically based on data within tables, reducing need for manual intervention. So the solution itself has a functional requirement, but there's also the validation requirement. But what I'll do now is, rather than me talk about it and go into detail of the application at this stage, I'd like to hand over to Will. Will, as we heard from Carlos, is president of GQSI. GQSI has been with us right from the start, through the build-up and launch of the Prisym SaaS solution, and they were a valuable participant in our beta testing program. So I'll keep quiet for a minute and I'll hand over to Will. Over to you, Will.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Will Graham. I'm talking on behalf of GQSI. As Chris said, we started out with Prisym doing the development as a beta customer with them. So we've gone through a lot of challenges, and I want to just give a background on GQSI. We're basically here as a startup greenfield company for the medical device industry, and we're primarily doing UDI marking for laser marking and UDI labeling for the OEMs and the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. So basically, when we started out, we had a lot of different challenges, especially on the labeling side. A lot of our customers on the OEM level, they were using Prisym, various systems, and we were trying to figure out what was the best system to use. So we looked at Prisym and we tried to see if this would be a good fit for us. Some of our challenges were not only were we going to be labeling for the various OEMs, which have different type of standards, but we were also going to be dealing with actual Tier 1 suppliers and their labeling needs. So we had needed to be able to have a system that could respond to different requirements very quickly. We needed a system that was real flexible with meeting the demands of the different customers. And then with us having so many different label layouts from multiple customers, we were going to also have challenges of label stock and how we were going to change out the stock and different things like that. So we worked with Prisym and we expressed all of our concerns. We also had challenges of our various operators, if we were going to be operating on multiple shifts, who could actually go in and make adjustments, who could actually support us remotely on a different shift if we didn't have any type of IT support on the first shift present for the second shift. So basically, after discussing all these needs with Chris and the Prisym crew, we decided to go with this Prisym system and see if it would meet our needs for doing our various things. And it ended up being a very secure, reliable system, and basically we've all grown together. I want to talk a little bit about the validation requirements. Coming from a medical device supplier perspective, validation is everything. You're typically only as good as your quality certifications and your equipment and process validations. One of the reasons that we looked at Prisym because their system allowed us to validate the process simultaneously with our equipment, and we had a cloud base where we could communicate with our OEM customers on a regular basis. So that was also a very good point for using Prisym. So the validation system, it carried a lot of weight, and it will carry a lot of weight with our existing customers and our future customers because this Prisym system, even though it's also cloud-based as well as we're using it inside our process, the system is 100% completely validated. So that leads me into the error-proofing part of it. With us having different requirements from our customer, we needed operations to not be able to change label content, and having control of the actual system that we say, use, and do is paramount to the success of our operation. So we had to have a system that was easy to use, it was easy to navigate through, it was easy to train with, but yet we had a control over the system where we wouldn't have people going in messing around with it. So we also needed that 13485 FDA UDI requirement that everything, your entire process had to be in control. So we end up choosing Prisym. It was respected across the medical device industry. It's worked very well for us. And pretty much that's where we're at with the Prisym system. And if anyone have any questions, I guess we will deal with it later. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Will. That was very interesting, and hopefully it was insightful for the other attendees on the webinar. As Will said, if you have any questions, then throw them into the Q&A, and we'll address them later. So if we look at maybe drill down a little bit on Prisym SaaS itself, what is Prisym SaaS? as Will said, Prism ID is respected. We do have a reputation within the medical device sector and other sectors for delivering and helping customers to implement comprehensive and compliant label lifecycle management solutions. So our provenance includes a number of very large companies, from medical device, pharmaceutical, and clin trials, companies like Zimmer, Boston Scientific, B. Braun, Pfizer, and Covidien, and many others in other sectors. So what we've done is obviously that's given us a lot of experience, a lot of background, a lot of knowledge of what goes into these compliance requirements and systems. So we've taken that experience and tied it to the core of our Prism 360 solution. So the Prism 360 label management solution is our flagship product. We've taken the core of that and created a SaaS environment, a cloud-based SaaS environment, with that core scoped specifically for SMEs, for smaller organizations. By making it accessible in the cloud, you can then benefit from those generic SaaS benefits that we talked about earlier on. We've built a very tight security model around this. We have a unique customer handshake with the cloud across the internet. So in other words, every customer has a unique implementation in terms of their security connection to the SaaS environment. So that helps us to assure that people can only get to the login screen for the environment if they are already known to the environment. So that's, again, one of the closed system aspects. And clearly, as you can see from the screenshots, we've implemented the SSL protection on the website itself, so we have the green bar for that added level of assurance. Then, beneath the dedicated environment that each customer gets, we have the core functionality of controlled data management, the automation of the audit trail, the ability to implement 21 CFR Part 11 compliance for e-signatures recorded in the audit trail. We've got a very granular security model, so we'll reference the ability to ensure that operational staff couldn't make any changes to any labels. They can print them, they can see them, they can't make any changes. That's down to the security model that you can implement based on roles and so on. Clearly, you'd expect to be able to design labels in the environment. And then we have also within there a pre-approved printing process for production labels. In other words, a print process only enables the operator to print labels which are approved. So you can only print labels which have been approved for production through the formal print process, and the process of printing those labels, of course, is audited and tracked in the audit trail. So Prism SaaS drills into that kind of functionality, but does it within a SaaS environment, meaning you don't have to install the core of the software into your environment. But of course, there is the question of validation, which is the basis for what we're talking about today. And we call Prism SaaS compliance ready, and we say that because we've done as much as we can to reduce that validation burden to manage all levels for our customers. So a lot of the things that we talked about at the beginning are handled by the platform already. We don't call it compliance because there is still a little piece of work for the customer to do to ensure the final compliance is achieved, but we call it compliance ready because as much as possible we've enabled that to be achieved very quickly. We've implemented the environment into a life sciences focused cloud, so we're not installed into a typical consumer or mass market cloud environment. The cloud environment we're using is a third party, but it only delivers services to the life sciences industry, so they know what they're doing with life sciences. The underlying infrastructure is fully qualified, and is governed by strict quality assurance processes and systems. All of the infrastructure, therefore, we can take advantage of that provider's qualifications. Then we take our Prisym SaaS application, and each customer instance is formally qualified by us using a pre-approved installation qualification, and the installed software itself is formally tested in the cloud environment. So we then, on top of the cloud provider's platform, we implement our own testing and qualification processes, meaning that the customer has a minimum of validation work to do to achieve full compliance for their end-to-end process, and that essentially boils down to running the PQ with your own data. So the idea is you can actually get to a point where you can have a rapid and cost-effective deployment through the SaaS offering, and as part of that, you get to a compliant status quickly. We provide a documentation pack of the IQs that we've executed specifically for your environment, and we can provide an IQ document that you can run in your environment that takes you through the process of installing the secure client component. If you want to use your own document, you can, of course, but we can provide that for you, and you can just use our document. So to get back to the beginning of the session, just to summarize here, the question was, can the cloud help? We absolutely believe that it can. Cloud and SaaS solutions are mainstream. And for SMEs, for the small and medium-sized companies, the quality of SaaS offerings available today and the benefits that they provide are significant. And these days they will often outweigh any concerns, the cost efficiencies that you can make and the effectiveness of what you're implementing. So cloud and SaaS are mainstream, and these life sciences applications are beginning to follow suit. There's an increasing number of SaaS offerings available, delivering services which are focused on life sciences customers to offer those same kinds of benefits that SaaS is offering across the board at the moment. So that's a growing space. The nature of the solution itself is compliance ready, as I've mentioned, but the nature of the underlying solution, because of the automation built in, the protection, the management and so on, reducing risk of errors that can lead to reducing the risk of errors that can lead to products being recalled because of labeling errors, for example. So removing as much of that manual intervention, that manual input as possible, and taking advantage of the compliance-ready nature of the platform. So we believe that the cloud can help. We believe it can help you get to a compliance and a compliance status very quickly, and help you to address and meet the challenges that you face to achieve those regulations with the limited resources that you have. So it does help in that respect as well. Obviously, we would invite you to try it for yourselves to find out, but I'd like to thank you today for your time. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Will Graham again for her slides. And Carlos, I'll throw it back to you for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Chris. A few of you already submitted questions, so we're going to jump right in. If you'd like to submit a question, type your question into the question window on the side of your screen and hit the submit button. While we are answering your questions, please complete the feedback form, which is located on the bottom of your screen. First question: does using a SaaS solution require any special changes to the company network environment?
That's probably one for me, Carlos. I mean, obviously it depends on the solution. And, clearly that's a question which doesn't necessarily apply to life sciences, but, depends on the solution, but typically it doesn't. Most SaaS offerings are internet-based or using the internet for access. So, in the case of Prisym SaaS, for example, if the machine from which you need to access the SaaS offering has access to the internet, then you shouldn't need to make any changes. The only thing that sometimes may happen is the organization may operate a sort of white list policy, and by that I mean they list a number of servers that can be accessed across the internet. So it might be necessary to add the target URL to that whitelist, but that's that's dependent on the company. But that isn't really a change to the network. That's just a configuration. But typically, that's not something which is a problem.
Thank you, Chris. Next question. If I use a SaaS solution for labeling, does it impact my existing compliance?
I can answer that from our perspective. I don't know whether Will would have any additional comments when I've finished. But if you obviously can continue to use your existing process. I mean, you can run processes alongside each other. I think one of the things I talked about was being able to do this with minimal disruption to your production environment. So you can continue to use your existing process, while you're getting comfortable with the SaaS offering, and as you transition to it. Obviously, if you're adopting a SaaS solution, we would recommend that you do things like a supplier audit, user acceptance testing, and so on. Usual validation summary reports and what have you, but the short answer is no. You don't need to change your existing compliance processes, but by moving to SaaS, there are advantages, so you may want to adopt and adapt accordingly as you transition.
Next question.
I don't know.
I'm sorry. Will, do you have any comment?
I pretty much agree with Chris. Fortunately for us, we were in a greenfield position when we started our system, so I can't add a lot to that other than the system that we were going to use, pretty much we did use it simultaneously while we were doing the development of the Prisym system.
Cool.
Thank you. Next question. Does the SaaS environment for labeling mean the supplier is responsible for compliance?
I think the answer to that again is no. We as a supplier, certainly we're not responsible for the compliance of the customer. We can provide the solutions, we can provide the tools, the application, and so on to help that compliance being achieved. But ultimately, it's the organisation that has to meet those requirements, that has to be responsible for the compliance itself. So what the supplier does or should do is make achieving and maintaining this compliance easier. But we the supplier, or whoever the supplier is not per se responsible for compliance itself. That's always the responsibility of the organisation that has to achieve it.
Okay. If we get audited, let's say by the FDA, does a SaaS solution pose any problems for accessing the necessary documents?
Well, again, it's going to depend on the provider. Again, documentation, that if we go back to that GAMP recommendation, leveraging the supplier's expertise, leveraging supplier input and so on, if you're using an environment that has been qualified by the provider, then the provider should be offering you the documentation you need to prove that. I mean, one of the things we had to do, of course, with the cloud provider that we decided to use, we looked at a few of them. There are a few out there, but we looked at a few. We did on-site checks. We looked at their security systems, but also our testing and validation team conducted an audit based around their documentation. So we wanted to see what their documentation was for their environment in terms of the audit we did on them. And then once we'd signed up to them, we had to implement our systems, or at least they had to implement the systems that we used, but they had to do that through their qualification process. So we had access to their IQs for our underlying machines in our SaaS environment. So in that case, we were kind of the customer for that SaaS platform, and we had full access to their documentation. And then if one of our Prisym SaaS customers is subject to an audit, whether it be by the FDA or whoever, then we can provide them with access not only to our documentation that we've implemented for their environment, we can also give them access to the underlying infrastructure documentation. So it should always be possible for the SaaS solution provider to give you access to the documents that you require. Whether that's always the case, I don't know, but certainly in the case of Prisym SaaS, that's part of what we built into the offering, that capability.
Thank you.
Any more questions, Carl?
We have one more question, and then we'll be wrapping up for today. Is there a risk that my data will be accessible to other SaaS customers?
Well, again, I can only speak for Prisym SaaS. Well, I can speak that there shouldn't be in any situation. I mean, if you have a SaaS solution that's been properly built, designed, architected, and what have you, that clearly goes back to that primary concern in the presentation of security. But I mean, clearly the answer to that question should be no. I mean, certainly in the case of Prisym SaaS, I mentioned that the customers are operating within a dedicated environment to which only users granted by the customer are given access. So you have control over creating users within the environment, and within that you can apply your own security. But each customer has a unique and dedicated environment, so there's no risk of one organisation seeing data from another organisation. Actually that's quite an important point as well. That goes back to that comment I again made earlier about the cloud or SaaS provider instigating frequent testing. One of the things they will do as a penetration test, the independent testers, they will try and do this. They will try and access from one customer environment into another. So that's part of the testing regime that should be implemented. So the answer to that question should always be no.
Thank you very much, Chris and Will. Well, that concludes today's presentation. On behalf of Machine Design, I'd like to thank Prisym ID for sponsoring today's event, and of course all of you for joining in. Have a great remainder of the day.